California, England, 1940-1941. The letter arrived at North American Aviation's Inglewood plant on a gray April morning in 1940, stamped with British Air Ministry seals and carrying the weight of a nation at war. Sir Henry Self's purchasing commission had a problem. Britain needed fighters, hundreds of them, and needed them yesterday. The Spitfire production lines couldn't keep pace with the Luftwaffe's appetite for destruction. Could North American build Curtiss P-40 Warhawks under license? James H. Dutch Kindleberger, NAA's president, read the proposal and turned to his chief of preliminary design. Edgar Schmued was 40 years old, a self-taught engineer who'd fled post-war Germany for Brazil, then worked his way to California via General Motors and Fokker. He had no formal degree, had never attended university, but his pencil could translate aerodynamic theory into metal and speed. Ed, do we want to build P-40s here? Schmued had been waiting for exactly this question. His answer came without hesitation. Well, Dutch, don't let us build an obsolete airplane. Let's build a new one. We can design and build a better one. It was an audacious claim. The P-40 was combat-proven. North American had never designed a fighter from scratch. Their reputation rested on trainers like the T-6 Texan and the yet unproven B-25 Mitchell bomber. But Schmued wasn't bluffing. He'd been studying fighter design for years, watching the evolution of European combat aircraft, absorbing every technical report that crossed his desk. He knew exactly what he wanted to build. The British, desperate and skeptical in equal measure, gave them 120 days to deliver a prototype, not a production aircraft, just proof the concept could fly. What followed was engineering at the edge of exhaustion. Schmued assembled a small team and began working 18-hour days. The design emerged in a blur of calculations, wind tunnel data purchased from Curtiss for $56,000, and hand-drawn blueprints that slowly revealed something genuinely new. A low-wing monoplane with laminar flow wings designed by NACA, a streamlined fuselage, and an innovative belly-mounted radiator that actually contributed to thrust through the Meredith effect. The engine was an Allison V17-1039, a 12-cylinder liquid-cooled inline producing 150 horsepower. It was the same power plant as the P-40, reliable and strong at sea level. Schmued's team designed the airframe around it with ruthless efficiency, minimal drag, maximum internal fuel capacity, and a structure light enough to maximize speed without sacrificing range. On September 9, 1940, exactly 117 working days after the British order, the NA-73X prototype was rolled out of the Inglewood hangar. It was beautiful in the way purely functional objects sometimes are, sleek, purposeful, absent of unnecessary decoration. The polished aluminum skin caught the California sun. Test pilot Vance Breese looked it over and nodded approval. The first flight came on October 26, 1940. Breese took it up cautiously, testing controls, feeling for instabilities. The plane responded crisply. At medium altitude, it was fast, genuinely fast. He landed with a satisfied grin. In subsequent tests, the NA-73X proved faster than the P-40 despite using the same engine. Schmued's obsession with drag reduction had paid off. The British were impressed enough to order 320 aircraft designated NA-73 by North American and christened Mustang by the RAF in December 1940. A second order for 300 more followed. The USAAF, watching from the sidelines, quietly ordered 150 for evaluation. But as production Mustangs began reaching RAF squadrons in early 1942, critical flaw emerged, not in the airframe, but in its heart. England, February 1942. RAF Gatwick squadron leader Ian Campbell Ord watched his pilots taxi their new Mustang Moiz onto the tarmac. They were assigned to No. 26 Squadron Army Cooperation Command, a backwater posting for what was supposed to be a frontline fighter. The reason was painfully simple: altitude performance. Below 15,000 feet, the Mustang was magnificent. Pilots raved about its speed, range, and handling. The cockpit visibility was excellent. The 450 caliber machine guns packed serious punch. For low-altitude tactical reconnaissance and ground attack, it had no equal among Allied fighters. but climb above 15,000 feet and the Mustang began to suffocate. The problem lay in the Allison V1710's single-stage, single-speed supercharger. At sea level and medium altitudes, it performed admirably, but as atmospheric pressure dropped, the supercharger couldn't maintain manifold pressure. Power fell off rapidly. By 20,000 feet, the Mustang was sluggish. By 25,000 feet, it was nearly helpless. This was catastrophic. Luftwaffe fighters, the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190, operated comfortably at 20,000 to 30,000 feet, where their supercharged engines maintained power. Bomber formations flew high to avoid flak. Fighter escorts needed to match that altitude. The air war was being fought in the thin atmosphere where the Mustang couldn't breathe, so the RAF relegated it to Army Cooperation Command. Low-level reconnaissance, photo missions, ground attack along the French coast, dangerous work, but not the decisive air superiority combat the aircraft's speed suggested it could handle. Pilots loved and cursed it in equal measure. Flight Lieutenant Tony Hill of No. 2 Squadron summarized the sentiment perfectly after a sortie over occupied France. Below 10,000 feet, she'll outrun anything the Germans have. Above 20,000, she's a sitting duck. It's like flying a racehorse that's terrified of heights. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. North American had built an aerodynamically superior airframe, lighter, cleaner, and longer range than anything else in the Allied inventory, and then bolted in an engine that couldn't exploit those advantages where they mattered most. Allison had attempted to develop a high-altitude variant, the V1710-45, with a variable speed auxiliary supercharger. In November 1941, and at sea studied the possibility of installing it in the Mustang. The conclusion was grim. The engine was too long. Fitting it would require extensive airframe modifications, disrupting the production lines that were finally hitting their stride. It would delay deliveries by months, perhaps a year. The Mustang remained trapped in the low-altitude role, a compromise aircraft performing missions its design had never intended. Across the Atlantic, a different crisis was unfolding. By late 1942, the United States Army Air Force's daylight bombing campaign over Europe was hemorrhaging aircraft and crews at an unsustainable rate. The strategic doctrine that heavily armed bombers flying in tight defensive formations could fight their way to targets and back without fighter escort was collapsing under the weight of reality. B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators were magnificent machines, bristling with 50-caliber guns and crewed by brave men, but they were also slow, unarmored in critical areas, and desperately vulnerable to coordinated fighter attacks. The Luftwaffe had learned to exploit every weakness, head-on attacks to kill pilots and bombardiers, attacks from below where turret coverage was thin, and rocket-firing standoff tactics that shattered formations before bombers could return effective fire. Available escort fighters, the RAF's Spitfire MKV and the USAAF's P-47 Thunderbolt, could barely reach the German border with drop tanks. Once they turned back due to fuel limitations, the bombers faced the gauntlet alone. Losses mounted. Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Münster. Mission after mission churned crews into statistics. In Washington and London, planners pored over maps and argued about solutions. Some advocated switching to night bombing like RAF Bomber Command. Others pushed for developing an entirely new long-range escort fighter. But both options required time, and time was measured in lost bombers and dead aircrews. Somewhere in the intelligence reports, amid discussions of range, altitude performance, and production capacity, the Mustang's name appeared. Its internal fuel capacity and efficient aerodynamics gave it exceptional range, but that was meaningless without an engine that could fight at 25,000 feet. What the Mustang needed wasn't a redesign, it needed a transplant. And in a Rolls-Royce hangar at Hucknall, England, a test pilot was about to make that exact suggestion. The numbers told a story of systematic slaughter. On August 17, 1943, the 8th Air Force dispatched 376 B-17 Flying Fortresses on a dual-target mission, Schweinfurt's ball-bearing factories and Regensburg's Messerschmitt production plants. The plan was tactically sound on paper. Split the Luftwaffe's defensive forces, by hitting two critical targets simultaneously, with the Regensburg formation continuing. To North Africa after the bomb run. Weather delayed the Schweinfurt force. The Regensburg bombers departed on schedule. German fighter controllers quickly understood what was happening. They could engage the first wave, land, refuel, rearm, and intercept the delayed second formation, which is exactly what they did. 60 B-17s failed to return. Each carried a crew of 10 men. Some bailed out over occupied territory and became prisoners. Many died in their burning aircraft. Others were cut in half by 20mm cannon shells or shredded by rocket explosions. The sky over Bavaria was littered with parachutes, flaming wreckage, and aluminum debris. At Thurley Airdrome, home of the 306th Bomb Group, ground crews waited as dusk settled. 15 B-17s had departed that morning. 5 returned. 10 bombers, 100 men, were simply gone. Some aircraft limped back so shot up they would never fly again, their aluminum skins punctured by hundreds of holes, hydraulic fluid pooling on the hard stands, blood still wet in the fuselage. The raid did damage the target. Intelligence estimated ball-bearing production dropped by 34%, but the Nazis had enormous stockpiles and alternative suppliers across occupied Europe. Within 6 weeks, production had recovered. The strategic effect was minimal. The human cost was catastrophic. General Ira Eaker, commanding the 8th Air Force, knew the mathematics were unsustainable. Bomber crews were required to complete 25 missions before rotating home. Statistically, with loss rates approaching 20% per mission, most crews would not survive their tours. The men knew it too. They watched the empty bunks multiply, sorted through the personal effects of friends, and climbed back into their aircraft the next morning because courage and duty demanded it. The planners in Washington and London had believed in a doctrine that heavy bombers flying in tight defensive formations called combat boxes could provide mutual fire support sufficient to reach any target in Europe. The B-17 was called the Flying Fortress for a reason, bristling with 10 50 caliber machine guns, capable of throwing up a wall of lead against attacking fighters. Reality disagreed. Luftwaffe fighter pilots, experienced, aggressive, and tactically sophisticated, had learned to exploit every weakness. They attacked head-on, where the B-17's defensive armament was thinnest and closing speeds made accurate return fire nearly impossible. They used cannon-armed FW-190s to shred bombers from below. Where belly turret coverage was limited, they launched unguided rockets from outside effective machine gun range, breaking up formations so isolated stragglers could be picked off. Escort fighters helped, but their range was criminally inadequate. The Supermarine Spitfire, despite its legendary reputation, had been designed as a short-range interceptor. Even with drop tanks, RAF Spitfire squadrons could barely escort bombers to the French coast. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was more robust, heavily armed, and capable of absorbing battle damage, but its massive radial engine and heavy airframe meant fuel consumption was high. With external tanks, P-47s could reach western Germany before turning back. Beyond that point, the bombers were on their own. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning had better range thanks to its twin-engine design, but its complexity made it maintenance-intensive, and its performance above 25,000 feet was inconsistent. Engine problems plagued the European theater's P-38 squadrons. It was effective in the Mediterranean and Pacific, where altitude requirements were lower, but struggled in the freezing high-altitude environment over Germany. What the 8th Air Force desperately needed was a fighter that could match the range of the bombers, maintain performance at 25,000 to 30,000 feet, possess the speed and maneuverability to engage Luftwaffe interceptors on equal terms, and carry enough ammunition and fuel to escort formations all the way to Berlin and back. No such aircraft existed in the Allied inventory, or rather, none existed in the form needed. The crisis came to a head in October 1943, during what became known as Black Week. On October 8th, the target was Bremen. 7 B-17s from the 100th Bomb Group were shot down. On October 10th, Münster. 12 out of 13 bombers from the 100th Group failed to return, a loss rate exceeding 90%. The group earned a grim nickname, the Bloody 100th. Then came October 14th, Black Thursday. Schweinfurt again. The planners wanted another strike on the ball-bearing plants, hoping to compound the damage from August. This time the entire force, 291 B-17s, would hit Schweinfurt simultaneously rather than splitting targets. Escort would be maximized. P-47 Thunderbolts would cover the outbound and return legs as far as their fuel allowed. But the P-47s, inexplicably, were not equipped with drop tanks that day. Their range was even more limited than usual. Over western Germany, the fighters waggled their wings, the signal they were at fuel limits, and turned for home. The bomber stream continued east, alone. The Luftwaffe was waiting. Jagdgeschwader 1, 3, 11, and 26, some of Germany's most experienced fighter wings, threw everything they had at the formations, Bf-110s, FW-190s, and even twin-engine Bf-110s fitted with rocket launchers. The attacks began over Belgium and didn't stop until the bombers were back over the English Channel. For the bomber crews, it was sustained terror. Fighters diving from above, climbing from below, making head-on passes that lasted 2 or 3 seconds and left bombers shattered. Flak over the target added to the carnage. Crippled bombers dropped out of formation, trailing smoke, becoming easy prey for circling fighters. The ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt were hit hard. Bomb damage assessment photos showed collapsed buildings and cratered factory floors, but the cost was obscene. 60 B-17s were shot down outright. 12 more were so badly damaged they crashed on return or had to be scrapped. Another 121 returned with significant battle damage. Of 2,900 airmen who departed England that morning, approximately 650 were casualties. 594 listed as missing in action, many killed instantly, others captured after bailing out, 5 dead and damaged aircraft that made it home, and 43 wounded. The 306th Bomb Group lost 100 men in a single day. The 305th Bomb Group lost 130 men, 87% of its aircrew strength. At Polbrook, home of the 351st Bomb Group, pilot Wally Hoffman walked away from his shot-up B-17 and vomited in the grass. His co-pilot had been killed by a 20-millimeter shell that came through the windscreen. The top turret gunner had bled out over the target, and there'd been nothing anyone could do. They'd flown 3 hours back to England with a dead man in the turret and another in the cockpit. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding the USAAF, publicly declared the Schweinfurt raid a success. Privately, he and his staff knew the truth. Deep penetration daylight bombing without fighter escort was unsustainable, and if they continued at this loss rate, the 8th Air Force would be destroyed before it could achieve strategic effect. For the rest of 1943, deep strikes into Germany were suspended. The bombers stayed within fighter escort range and hitting targets in France in the Ruhr Valley. The strategic bombing campaign, the entire American doctrine of precision daylight bombing, was effectively on hold, waiting for a solution that could keep bombers alive long enough to matter. In London, Major Thomas Hitchcock, assistant air attaché and a former polo champion who understood the politics of air power, was reading intelligence reports about a fighter that kept appearing in marginal notes. The RAF was using it for low-level reconnaissance and ground attack. American pilots who'd flown it raved about its speed and handling. Its internal fuel capacity was exceptional. Its range, even without drop tanks, exceeded anything in the Allied inventory. The problem was altitude. The Allison engine strangled above 15,000 feet. But Hitchcock had also read reports from Rolls-Royce about an experimental program at their Hucknall facility. They'd taken a Mustang and installed a different engine, a Merlin, the same power plant that made the Spitfire Manon a high-altitude performer. The test results were extraordinary. Speed at 25,000 feet had increased by nearly 100 miles per hour. Service ceiling had jumped from 30,000 feet to over 40,000 feet. And critically, because of the Merlin's fuel efficiency and the Mustang's aerodynamic cleanliness, the range hadn't suffered. If anything, it had improved. Hitchcock began writing memos. Urgent, insistent memos to Wright Field and Washington. The Mustang, he argued, could be transformed from a low-altitude reconnaissance aircraft into the long-range, high-altitude escort fighter the 8th Air Force desperately needed. All it required was an engine swap. The resistance he encountered was political as much as technical. The Mustang was seen as a British project, designed to British specifications, primarily used by the RAF. It didn't have a champion within the USAAF hierarchy, as Hitchcock himself wrote in frustration. Sired by the English out of an American mother, the Mustang has no parent in the Army Air Corps to appreciate and push its good points. But Black Thursday changed the calculus. 60 bombers in a single day was not a sustainable loss rate. The strategic bombing campaign could not wait years for a purpose-built long-range fighter to be designed from scratch. They needed a solution now, and at Hucknall, in a converted Mustang with a Rolls-Royce badge on its engine cowling, that solution already existed. It just needed to be mass-produced before the bomber offensive bled itself to death. The clock was ticking, measured in the lives of bomber crews who climbed into their aircraft each morning knowing the statistics were not in their favor. Ronald Harker was not easily impressed. As a test pilot for Rolls-Royce, he'd flown nearly every high-performance aircraft in the RAF inventory. Spitfires, Hurricanes, Typhoons, Mosquitoes. He understood what separated mediocre designs from exceptional ones, and he knew that truly great aircraft were rare. In April 1942, Wing Commander Ian Campbell Ord invited him to RAF Duxford to fly something unusual, an American fighter the RAF was using for Army cooperation missions. The Mustang Mk Harker arrived skeptical. American fighters had not distinguished themselves in European combat. The P-40 was adequate, but unremarkable. The P-39 era Cobra was considered nearly useless at high altitude. Harker climbed into the Mustang's cockpit and went through the pre-flight checks. The first thing that struck him was visibility. The bubble canopy and low cowling gave him an excellent view. The controls felt crisp during taxi. He advanced the throttle and lifted off. For the first 15 minutes, Harker flew the Mustang through standard test maneuvers. Climbs, turns, dives, stalls. The aircraft responded beautifully. It was fast, genuinely fast. The handling was precise without being twitchy. The laminar flow wing gave it unusually clean aerodynamics. At 10,000 feet, it felt like one of the best fighters he'd flown. Then he climbed to 20,000 feet. The performance degradation was immediate and unmistakable. Power dropped off, climb rate deteriorated. By 25,000 feet, the Mustang was laboring. It was still controllable, but the engine was struggling to maintain manifold pressure. And Me-109 or FW-190 at this altitude would have a decisive advantage. Harker landed and immediately wrote a memo to Rolls-Royce management. The Mustang, he concluded, had an exceptional airframe, possibly the best he'd encountered in terms of aerodynamic efficiency and range, but it was crippled by an engine that couldn't perform where modern air combat occurred. The solution, he suggested, was obvious. Replace the Allison with a Merlin. Specifically, he recommended the Merlin 61, a two-stage, two-speed supercharged variant that had recently entered service in the Spitfire Mustang. The Merlin 61 supercharger, designed by Stanley Hooker, was an engineering masterpiece. It used two separate impellers on the same shaft, with an intercooler between stages to reduce compressed air temperature. This allowed the engine to maintain power at altitudes where single-stage superchargers suffocated. At 25,000 feet, the Merlin 61 produced nearly 1,300 horsepower. At 30,000 feet, it still generated over 1,000 horsepower. Critically, the two-stage supercharger improved fuel efficiency at cruise settings. The engine wasn't working as hard to compress intake air. Rolls-Royce management, intrigued by Harker's assessment, secured 5 Mustang airframes for conversion. The project was designated Mustang X. The engineering team at Hucknall faced several challenges. The Merlin was heavier than the Allison, approximately 350 pounds more, which would shift the aircraft's center of gravity forward. The two-stage supercharger also generated more heat, requiring a larger cooling system. The team installed broader radiators in the belly scoop and added a secondary chin radiator under the nose. They fitted a 4-bladed rotor propeller to absorb the increased power. To correct the center of gravity shift, they moved the entire wing forward slightly. The modifications were completed in just over 4 months. On October 13, 1942, Rolls-Royce Chief Test Pilot Ronald Shepard took the first Mustang X, serial number AL975, into the air. The transformation was immediately apparent. Shepard climbed to 22,000 feet and opened the throttles. The Mustang accelerated smoothly to 433 miles per hour. At full boost, the engine was producing 1,120 horsepower. He climbed higher. At 30,000 feet, the Merlin was still pulling strongly. The Mustang's service ceiling, previously around 30,000 feet with the Allison, now exceeded 40,000 feet. The rate of climb had nearly doubled. The handling characteristics remained excellent. Shepard landed and filed his report. The Merlin-Mustang combination was exceptional. It matched or exceeded the performance of the Spitfire Minion at high altitude while maintaining the Mustang's superior range. This wasn't just an improvement, it was a complete transformation. Testing continued through November and December. The remaining 4 Mustang X aircraft were fitted with Merlin 65 engines, a slightly different variant optimized for medium-high altitude operation. The results were consistent, speeds exceeding 410 miles per hour at altitude, service ceilings above 40,000 feet, and crucially, no significant reduction in range. The engineering was surprisingly clean. The Merlin's dimensions allowed it to fit into the Mustang's engine bay with minimal airframe modifications. The cooling system upgrades worked efficiently. The 4-bladed propeller, while heavier, improved takeoff performance and climb rate. The aircraft's weight increased, but the power-to-weight ratio remained favorable. Across the Atlantic, North American Aviation was conducting a parallel program. In July 1942, even before the first Mustang X flew, the USAAF had authorized NAA to develop a Merlin-powered variant. The catalyst was Major Thomas Hitchcock, who had been sending increasingly urgent reports from London about the Mustang X project. NAA's engineering team, led by Edgar Schmued, began working with Packard Motor Company, which was licensed building Merlin engines in Detroit. The Packard V1653 was mechanically identical to the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61, but manufactured using American production techniques and tooling. The American program moved quickly. By August 1942, before any Merlin-powered Mustang had flown, the USAAF placed an order for 400 aircraft. The initial designation was XP-78, but this was quickly changed to XP-51B to maintain continuity with the existing P-51 program. NAA took 2 P-51 airframes that had been built for the RAF and installed Packard Merlins. The modifications mirrored Rolls-Royce's work. Enlarged radiators, 4-bladed Hamilton standard propellers, adjusted wing position. The first XP-51B flew on November 30th, 1942, just weeks after the Mustang X program in England. The performance matched British results. At 25,000 feet, the XP-51B reached 441 miles per hour. Service ceiling was 42,000 feet. Most importantly, NAA calculated that with internal fuel and 2 75-gallon drop tanks, the P-51B could escort bombers to targets 850 miles from base, covering virtually every strategic target in Western Germany, including Berlin. The numbers were almost too good to believe. Existing escort fighters could barely reach the German border. The proposed solution could reach Berlin and back with fuel to spare. Some USAAF planners were skeptical, suspecting the calculations were optimistic, but flight tests confirmed the projections. The Mustang's aerodynamic efficiency, combined with the Merlin's fuel economy at cruise settings, produced extraordinary range. There was, however, a significant obstacle: production capacity. Rolls-Royce's Merlin production lines were fully committed to Spitfires, Lancasters, and Mosquitoes. The RAF couldn't spare engines for American fighters, no matter how promising. The British Mustang X program remained experimental. Only 5 aircraft were converted. The RAF continued using Allison-powered Mustangs for low-altitude missions, while the Spitfire handled high-altitude interception. The American solution depended entirely on Packard's production ramp-up. The Detroit plant had to manufacture thousands of V1650 engines while maintaining quality control and meeting demanding delivery schedules. Any delays in engine production would delay fighter deliveries, which meant more bomber crews dying over Germany. Packard engineers worked around the clock. The Merlin was a complex engine, precision-built with tight tolerances and dozens of components that had to be manufactured to exacting specifications. Adapting British engineering drawings to American manufacturing standards required extensive consultation with Rolls-Royce. Tooling had to be designed and built. Workers had to be trained. By early 1943, Packard VA 1650 production was accelerating. NAI established production lines at both their Inglewood, California plant, designated P-51B, and a new facility in Dallas, Texas, designated P-51C. The B and C models were mechanically identical. The different designations simply indicated which factory built them. The P-51B incorporated several refinements beyond the engine swap. Internal fuel capacity was increased by adding an 85-gallon fuselage tank behind the pilot's seat. This created a center of gravity issue when the tank was full, making the aircraft tricky to handle until fuel burned down. But it dramatically extended range. Wing racks allowed the attachment of drop tanks, initially 75-gallon, later increased to a 110-gallon capacity. Armament was standardized at 4 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 2 per wing, with 350 rounds per gun for the inboard weapons and 280 rounds for the outboard. This was fewer guns than the original Mustang MKY's A8 gun armament, but the weight savings improved performance, and 450s still provided formidable firepower. The canopy remained the original frame design, which limited rearward visibility, a significant disadvantage in combat. British squadrons began field modifying their aircraft with Malcolm Hood canopies, which improved visibility. American pilots made similar requests. NAA was already designing a bubble canopy for future production, but that would take months to engineer and test. By late 1943, P-51Bs were rolling off production lines in significant numbers. The first aircraft were delivered to the 8th Air Force in England in November. Fighter groups began transitioning from P-47s and P-38s to the new Mustang. Pilots who flew it were immediately impressed. It was faster than the P-47, more reliable than the P-38, and its range exceeded both. But there was still bureaucratic resistance, as some USAAF leadership remained skeptical of a fighter that had been designed for the British and was powered by a British engine. The P-47 had powerful advocates who argued it was more robust and could absorb more battle damage. The not invented here syndrome was real. What changed minds was Black Thursday. 60 B-17s lost in a single mission was a crisis that overrode parochial concerns about national pride. The strategic bombing campaign could not continue without long-range fighter escort. The P-51B was the only aircraft that could provide it in operationally significant numbers. Production accelerated. Packard's Merlin output increased month by month. NAA hired additional workers and expanded factory floor space. By early 1944, P-51s were being delivered at a rate of hundreds per month. Fighter groups across England were re-equipping. The transformation from experimental concept to operational fighter had taken less than 18 months, from Harker's first flight in April 1942 to combat-ready squadrons in late 1943. In the context of World War II aircraft development, this was remarkably fast. It helped that the basic airframe already existed and had proven itself structurally sound. The engine swap, while complex, didn't require a complete redesign. What had been created was almost accidental in its perfection. An American airframe designed by a German immigrant, powered by a British engine license-built in Detroit, combining the aerodynamic efficiency of NACA research with the supercharger technology of Rolls-Royce engineering. It was a genuinely international weapon born from desperate necessity and enabled by technical brilliance. In February 1944, the 8th Air Force resumed deep penetration raids into Germany. This time, P-51 Mustangs flew with the bombers all the way to the target and back. The Luftwaffe, accustomed to having free rein once short-range escorts turned back, suddenly faced high-performance fighters at 25,000 feet over their own airfields. The dynamics of the air war were about to shift decisively. The crisis of the bombers was ending. The crisis for the Luftwaffe was just beginning. The memo sat on a desk at Wright Field, Ohio, for 3 weeks before anyone responded. Major Thomas Hitchcock had written it in October 1942, shortly after the first Mustang X test flights at Hucknall. The data was extraordinary, speeds exceeding 430 miles per hour at 30,000 feet, service ceiling above 40,000 feet, range estimates suggesting the aircraft could escort bombers to any target in Germany. Hitchcock had included detailed performance charts, testimonials from Rolls-Royce test pilots, and projections showing how quickly production could be scaled if Packard's Merlin output increased. The response from USAF leadership was tepid. Some expressed interest. Others questioned whether the performance claims were realistic. Several pointed out that the P-47 Thunderbolt was already in production and had powerful advocates within the service. The P-38 Lightning was being deployed to Europe in growing numbers. Did they really need a third fighter type, especially one that depended on a British engine? Hitchcock was incredulous. He wrote another memo, more forceful this time, emphasizing the crisis unfolding over Germany. Bomber losses were unsustainable. Existing escorts couldn't reach the targets. The Merlin Mustang wasn't a theoretical proposal. It existed, it flew, and it performed exactly as advertised. All that was needed was a production decision. He included a quote from his own assessment. Sired by the English out of an American mother, the Mustang has no parent in the Army Air Corps. To appreciate and push its good points, it does not fully satisfy good people on both sides of the Atlantic who seem more interested in pointing with pride to the development of a 100% national product. The problem was precisely that mixed parentage. The Mustang had been designed to British specifications. The RAF had been its first customer. The transformative engine was British. Within the USAF hierarchy, no senior officer had staked their reputation on the Mustang program. It was an orphan aircraft lacking a bureaucratic champion to fight for resources and priority. Meanwhile, the P-47 had General Henry Hap Arnold's support. Republic Aviation had cultivated relationships with key decision-makers. The Thunderbolt was presented as a robust, purely American fighter capable of taking punishment and continuing to fly. Its radial engine was less vulnerable to battle damage than liquid-cooled inline engines. These were legitimate advantages, and they were emphasized repeatedly in briefings and reports. The P-38, despite its maintenance issues, also had institutional support. Lockheed had a strong reputation, and the twin-engine design appealed to bomber advocates who believed multi-engine redundancy was essential for long-range missions. The Mustang, by contrast, was built by North American Aviation, a company known for trainers and the B-25 medium bomber, not fighters. Its designer was Edgar Schmued, a self-taught immigrant engineer without connections to the Air Corps establishment. Its engine came from Britain, which raised questions about supply chain reliability and political optics. Even as test data accumulated showing the P-51B's superiority in range and high-altitude performance, procurement decisions moved slowly. Contracts were issued, but production priority remained with the P-47 and P-38. Fighter groups in England continued flying Thunderbolts on escort missions that barely reached the German border before fuel limitations forced them to turn back. The human cost of this bureaucratic inertia was measured in bomber crews. Every week of delay meant more B-17s and B-24s going down over Germany. More men killed, captured, or crippled. The statistics were brutal. By mid-1943, the odds of surviving a 25-mission combat tour were approximately 1 in 4. Statistically, 3 out of every 4 bomber crewmen would be killed, severely wounded, or captured before completing their required missions. Hitchcock wasn't alone in his frustration. Within the RAF, officers who'd flown the Mustang X were equally baffled by American hesitancy. Sir Wilfrid Freeman, chief executive at the Ministry of Aircraft Production, lobbied for immediate large-scale production. He argued that the Merlin Mustang could change the strategic balance in Europe if deployed in sufficient numbers. But Freeman also faced constraints. Rolls-Royce couldn't spare Merlin engines from Spitfire and bomber production. The 5 Mustang X aircraft remained experimental. The RAF would have to wait for Packard production to scale up, same as the Americans. The breakthrough came not through rational argument, but through crisis. Black Thursday, October 14, 1943, forced a reckoning. 60 bombers lost in a single day was a disaster that couldn't be explained away with optimistic assessments of strategic damage. The daylight bombing campaign was on the verge of collapse. General Ira Eaker, commanding the 8th Air Force, wrote a blunt assessment to Arnold. Deep penetration missions without fighter escort to the target were unsustainable. Either provide long-range fighters immediately or suspend strategic bombing until they became available. The alternative was to destroy the 8th Air Force through attrition before it achieved meaningful effect. Arnold, facing pressure from the Joint Chiefs and President Roosevelt to demonstrate that daylight precision bombing could work, finally prioritized the P-51 program. Contracts were accelerated. Production quotas were increased. Fighter groups in England were informed they would begin transitioning to Mustangs as soon as aircraft became available. But even then, the bureaucratic obstacles weren't eliminated. They were simply overridden. Within the USAAF, there remained officers who questioned whether a British engined fighter should become the primary escort. Some argued for waiting until a purpose-built long-range fighter could be developed from scratch. Others suggested modifying the P-47 with additional fuel capacity. North American Aviation, meanwhile, was dealing with its own challenges. Scaling up P-51B production required expanding factory space, hiring thousands of additional workers, and coordinating with Packard to ensure engine deliveries matched airframe production. Any mismatch would create bottlenecks. The company opened a second production line in Dallas, Texas, to supplement the Inglewood, California facility. The Dallas plant produced P-51Cs, mechanically identical to the B model, but manufactured in a different location to spread production risk and increase output. Quality control was critical. The Merlin engine was complex with tight tolerances and numerous components that had to be precisely manufactured. Any defects in engine production would ground aircraft. Packard worked closely with Rolls-Royce to maintain specifications while adapting manufacturing processes to American tooling and techniques. By late 1943, production was accelerating. In November, the first P-51Bs were delivered to the 8th Air Force. The 354th Fighter Group, based at Boxstead, England, became the first operational unit to fly the Merlin-powered Mustang in combat. Pilots transitioning from P-47s and P-38s were immediately impressed. Captain Don Gentile, an American pilot flying with the RAF before transferring to the USAAF, described his first impression. When you've been flying a Jug, P-47 nickname, and you climb into a Mustang, it's like switching from a truck to a sports car. The visibility's better, the controls are lighter, and the range is ridiculous. You can actually stay with the bombers all the way, but combat operations revealed issues that hadn't been apparent in testing. The fuselage fuel tank behind the pilot, while essential for range, created handling problems. When full, it shifted the center of gravity aft, making the aircraft unstable. Pilots had to burn down that tank before engaging in combat maneuvers. If jumped by enemy fighters while the fuselage tank was still full, the Mustang could be dangerously difficult to control. The framed canopy limited rearward visibility, a critical disadvantage in air combat where most kills came from unseen attackers. Pilots repeatedly requested the bubble canopy they'd seen on late-model P-47s. North American was already designing one, but engineering and testing would take months. Gun jamming was another problem. The .450 caliber Brownings were reliable weapons, but the Mustang's wing was thinner than the P-47's, and there was less space for ammunition feed mechanisms. At high altitude and in tight turns, guns sometimes jammed. Armorers worked on fixes, stronger feed springs, modified ammunition chutes, better cold weather lubrication. Despite these teething problems, the P-51B's operational impact was immediate. In December 1943, Mustangs escorted bombers to Kiel on Germany's northern coast, far beyond the range of P-47s. The Luftwaffe, accustomed to engaging unescorted bombers over Germany, suddenly faced long-range fighters at altitudes where the Mustang's performance was superior. Bomber losses dropped, not eliminated. Flak still killed and German fighters still pressed attacks, but the casualty rate decreased significantly. For the first time since the bombing campaign began, crews had a realistic chance of surviving their 25 mission tours. But full operational deployment was still months away. Only a handful of fighter groups had transitioned to the P-51B by the end of 1943. Most escort missions were still flown by P-47s, which meant most targets remained beyond effective escort range. The crisis had been acknowledged, a solution had been identified, but implementation lagged. The bureaucratic resistance that had nearly killed the program left a bitter taste. Hitchcock's memos from 1942 had been prescient. If his recommendations had been acted upon immediately, how many bomber crews might have been saved? How many aircraft wouldn't have been lost? The delay between recognizing a solution and implementing it had been measured in lives. In February 1944, command of the 8th Air Force passed from Ira Eaker to Major General James "Jimmy" Doolittle, the pilot who'd led the first American bombing raid on Tokyo in April 1942. Doolittle was a combat veteran and an engineer with a doctorate from MIT, and a leader who understood both the technical and human dimensions of air warfare. One of his first directives was to maximize P-51 deployment. Every fighter group that could transition to Mustang should do so immediately. Production should be prioritized above all other fighter programs. The goal was simple: get long-range escorts to Berlin and beyond, and do it before the spring invasion of France. Doolittle also changed escort tactics. Previously, fighters had been instructed to stay close to bomber formations, providing direct protection. This was defensive and allowed German fighters to choose when and where to engage. Doolittle authorized fighters to hunt aggressively. If they saw enemy aircraft forming up to attack, they should engage immediately, rather than waiting for the attack to develop. This tactical shift transformed the Mustang from a defensive escort into an offensive weapon. P-51 pilots began sweeping ahead of bomber formations, engaging Luftwaffe fighters before they could reach the bombers. They followed damaged enemy aircraft back to their airfields and strafed them on the ground. They hunted systematically, exploiting the Mustang's speed and range to dominate the airspace. The combination of long-range, high-altitude performance and aggressive tactics created a lethal problem for the Luftwaffe. German pilots could no longer wait until Allied escorts turned back before attacking bombers. The escorts no longer turned back, and the Mustang, with its speed and maneuverability, was more than a match for the Bf-109 and FW-190 at high altitude. By March 1944, the transformation was complete. The P-51 Mustang had gone from experimental curiosity to operational necessity to primary escort fighter in less than 18 months. The bureaucratic obstacles that had delayed its deployment were swept aside by operational reality and leadership willing to act decisively. The crisis of the bombers was ending. The transformation of air superiority over Europe was beginning. And in the cockpits of those silver Mustangs, pilots were discovering what it meant to fly an aircraft that could go anywhere, fight anyone, and come home. The first P-51 Mustangs appeared over Berlin on March 4, 1944. It was a psychological shock as much as a tactical one. Berlin had been the fortress capital of the Third Reich, protected by hundreds of miles of occupied territory, defended by layers of flak batteries and fighter bases. RAF Bomber Command had been attacking the city at night since 1940, suffering horrific losses in the darkness. American daylight bombers had never reached it. The distance was simply too great for existing escorts. Until now. 630 B-17s and B-24s approached Berlin in massive combat formations, their contrails scratching white lines across the frozen sky. Flying with them and above them and ranging ahead were over 800 fighters. P-38s, P-47s, and for the first time in significant numbers, P-51 Mustangs. The fighters had enough fuel not just to reach Berlin, but to engage in combat and still make it home. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them. Jagdgeschwader 3, 11, and 26 threw everything available into the air. Over 100 German fighters engaged the formations, but this time the outcome was different. The American escorts didn't turn back. They didn't conserve fuel for the return flight. They fought aggressively, and they had the performance to win. Lieutenant Colonel James Howard of the 354th Fighter Group, was flying solo when he encountered a formation of 30 BF-109s and FW-190s positioning to attack the bombers. Rather than waiting for support, he dove into them alone. For 30 minutes, Howard engaged multiple fighters, shooting down at least 4 and driving off the rest. His aircraft took hits, his ammunition ran low, but he stayed between the Germans and the bombers until reinforcements arrived. He would receive the Medal of Honor for that mission. The bombers hit their targets and turned for home. 69 bombers were lost, a significant number, but far below the catastrophic losses of Black Thursday. The fighters lost 17 aircraft, but the strategic message was delivered. Nowhere in Germany was beyond American reach. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, reportedly stated after the raid, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." Whether he actually said those exact words is disputed by historians, but the sentiment was accurate. The appearance of long-range fighters over Berlin meant the entire logic of German air defense had collapsed. Previously, the Luftwaffe could husband its forces, waiting until Allied escorts turned back before launching mass attacks. Now they had to engage immediately, which meant fighting where American fighters had altitude, speed, and numerical advantage. The strategic calculus shifted decisively. The Luftwaffe could no longer preserve its forces by selective engagement. Every bomber raid now came with fighter escort all the way to the target. German fighters had to either let the bombers through or accept combat on unfavorable terms. Worse, the Mustangs didn't simply escort and disengage. Under Doolittle's new directives, they hunted. P-51 pilots swept ahead of bomber formations, engaging German fighters as they formed up for attacks. They followed damaged enemy aircraft back to their bases and strafed them on the ground. They lingered over German airfields during takeoff and landing, the most vulnerable moments in flight operations. The effect was systematic attrition. The Luftwaffe wasn't being destroyed in massive single battles. He was being bled dry through constant engagement. Every day, more experienced German pilots were killed or injured. Training programs couldn't replace them fast enough. Fuel shortages, caused in part by Allied bombing of synthetic fuel plants, meant reduced flying hours for trainees. New pilots arrived at operational units with inadequate preparation and died quickly. By late spring 1944, the Luftwaffe fighter force was in crisis. Production of new aircraft was actually increasing. German industry, despite Allied bombing, continued manufacturing fighters in impressive numbers. But without experienced pilots and adequate fuel, those aircraft couldn't be employed effectively. The Mustang's dominance was built on several factors working in concert. Range was the foundation. Without it, none of the tactical advantages mattered. But equally important was performance at combat altitudes, at 25,000 to 30,000 feet where bomber formations operated. The P-51B and the improved P-51D model had a slight decisive edge over the BF-109G and FW-190A. The Merlin engine's two-stage supercharger maintained power where single-stage designs struggled. The Mustang's laminar flow wing provided excellent high-speed handling. The aircraft's relatively light weight gave it superior acceleration and climb rate compared to the heavier P-47. In a turning fight, it could outturn the FW-190 and match the BF-109. Equally critical was visibility. The P-51D, which entered service in mid-1944, featured a bubble canopy that provided near 360-degree vision. In air combat, seeing the enemy first was often the difference between killing and being killed. The bubble canopy gave Mustang pilots a decisive advantage in situational awareness. Armament was adequate, if not overwhelming. The .650 caliber Browning machine guns of the P-51D, increased from 4 in the earlier BC models, provided substantial firepower. While some pilots preferred the heavier punch of cannon-armed aircraft, the Brownings were reliable, carried significant ammunition, and their trajectory made them relatively easy to aim. A well-aimed burst could shred an enemy fighter or cripple a bomber. The human element was equally important. American pilots received extensive training, hundreds of flight hours before reaching operational units. They understood air combat tactics, knew their aircraft's capabilities and limitations, and were supported by a logistics system that kept aircraft maintained and ready. The cultural emphasis on individual initiative meant pilots could exploit opportunities aggressively rather than waiting for orders. One of the most remarkable success stories was the 332nd Fighter Group, the Tuskegee Airmen. This unit, composed entirely of African American pilots, faced systemic racism both within the military and in American society. They were given outdated equipment initially, sent to secondary theaters, and doubted by white officers who believed black pilots lacked the intelligence and courage for air combat. The 332nd eventually received P-51s and was assigned to escort duty with the 15th Air Force, operating from bases in Italy. Their record was extraordinary. They flew 179 bomber escort missions over heavily defended targets in Germany, Austria, and the Balkans. They never lost a bomber under their direct protection to enemy fighters, a claim no other escort fighter group could make. Their P-51s were instantly recognizable, tails painted bright red, earning them the nickname Red Tails. Bomber crews specifically requested them as escorts. The 332nd's combat record spoke louder than any racist stereotype. Pilots like Lee Archer, Edward Gleed, and Charles McGee became aces. Captain Gleed, photographed standing in front of his red-tailed P-51D, embodied the quiet professionalism that characterized the unit. The 332nd's success was a direct challenge to segregation and racial discrimination. These pilots had proven that skill, courage, and determination weren't determined by skin color. They'd done so in the most unforgiving arena possible: air combat against an experienced and determined enemy. By summer 1944, the air superiority battle over Europe was effectively won. The Luftwaffe still existed, still fought, but it could no longer prevent Allied bombers from hitting their targets. German cities, synthetic fuel plants, transportation networks, and industrial facilities were being systematically destroyed. The strategic bombing campaign that nearly collapsed in late 1943 was now achieving its objectives. The invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, occurred under conditions of near total Allied air supremacy. German fighters made occasional appearances but were vastly outnumbered and quickly driven off. Ground forces advancing from the beaches rarely saw enemy aircraft. When they did see aircraft, they were almost always Allied. This air superiority was built on the backs of multiple aircraft types: P-47s, P-38s, Spitfires, Tempests, Typhoons. But the P-51 Mustang was the critical enabler. Its range allowed escorts to penetrate deep into Germany. Its performance allowed it to win the engagements that occurred there, and its availability in massive numbers, thousands of aircraft delivered by mid-1944, meant it could be everywhere. Production of the P-51D reached peak efficiency. North American Aviation's Inglewood and Dallas plants were churning out hundreds of aircraft per month. Packard's Merlin production kept pace. The supply chain, once a potential vulnerability, became a strength. By the end of 1944, over 8,000 P-51s had been delivered to operational units. The tactical evolution continued. Mustangs were adapted for ground attack roles, carrying bombs and rockets to strike German armor and supply lines. They served as reconnaissance aircraft, using their speed to evade interception while photographing enemy positions. They escorted photo reconnaissance missions and air-sea rescue operations. The versatility that Edgar Schmued had designed into the original airframe proved invaluable, but the core mission remained bomber escort, and in that role, the Mustang redefined what was possible. Missions that had been suicidal in 1943 became routine in 1944. Berlin, Munich, Vienna, Prague, every major city in Germany and occupied Europe came within range. Oil refineries, aircraft factories, tank plants, all were hit repeatedly. The strategic effect compounded over months of sustained operations. The human cost remained significant. P-51 pilots were shot down by flak, by enemy fighters, by mechanical failures, but the losses were sustainable, and more importantly, they were achieving decisive results. The air war was being won, and the Mustang was the instrument of that victory. By late 1944, Luftwaffe fighter resistance had diminished to the point where bomber formations sometimes reached targets without encountering any fighters at all. The German Day Fighter Force, which had been so lethal in 1943, was a shadow of its former strength. New jet fighters like the Me-262 were appearing in small numbers, but chronic fuel shortages and Allied air attacks on their bases limited their effectiveness. The rejected fighter, the aircraft that had been designed for the British, powered by a British engine and initially dismissed by American leadership, had become the dominant Allied fighter over Europe. It was in the skies over Berlin and Munich, over the Rhine and the Danube, escorting bombers and hunting enemy fighters. The transformation was complete. Air superiority belonged to the Allies, and the silver Mustangs with their distinctive profiles were the visible symbol of that dominance, etched against the contrails at 25,000 feet where the thin air once suffocated lesser machines. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. In England, American air bases fell silent after years of constant operations. Mustangs that had flown missions over Berlin and Dresden sat parked on hard stands, their engines cooling, their work finished. Pilots who'd survived combat tours prepared to rotate home or redeploy to the Pacific Theater. But the P-51's war was not over. In the Pacific, the strategic situation had evolved differently than in Europe. The vast distances between island bases and Japanese targets had initially seemed insurmountable for land-based fighters. Carrier-based aircraft provided air cover for amphibious operations, but they lacked the range and endurance for deep strategic bombing missions. The B-29 Superfortress could reach Japan from bases in China and later from the Mariana Islands, but it did so without fighter escort. The capture of Iwo Jima in February 1945 changed the equation. This small volcanic island, located roughly halfway between the Marianas and Japan, provided an emergency landing field for damaged B-29s returning from raids. More importantly, it could base fighters. In April 1945, P-51 Mustangs from the 7th Air Force began flying escort missions from Iwo Jima to Japan, a round trip of over 1,500 miles. The logistics were punishing. Pilots flew for 7 or 8 hours, much of it over open ocean where any mechanical failure meant ditching and hoping for air-sea rescue. The missions required external drop tanks, careful fuel management, and navigational precision, but they worked. On April 7, 1945, 108 P-51s escorted B-29s to Tokyo. It was the first time American fighters had operated over the Japanese home island since the Doolittle Raid in 1942. The psychological impact on Japanese morale was significant. The sacred homeland was no longer beyond reach. The Mustang's appearance in the Pacific validated its design philosophy. Range, efficiency, and high-altitude performance weren't just advantages. They were essential capabilities that no other fighter possessed in the same combination. The P-47 was too fuel-hungry for such extreme distances. The P-38, while effective in some Pacific theaters, lacked the Mustang's high-altitude performance and suffered maintenance issues in tropical conditions. By August 1945, when the atomic bombs ended the Pacific War, P-51s had flown hundreds of escort and ground attack missions over Japan. They'd provided air cover for naval operations, strafed airfields, and escorted reconnaissance flights. The aircraft, designed in 1940 for a British specification, had become the USAF's primary long-range fighter in both European and Pacific theaters. After the war ended, the question became what to do with thousands of now surplus fighters. The immediate post-war period saw massive demobilization. Production stopped. North American Aviation's Inglewood and Dallas plants shut down Mustang production lines and retooled for civilian aircraft and new military contracts. Packard ceased Merlin production. By late 1945, no new P-51s were being manufactured. Thousands of existing aircraft were declared surplus. Some were scrapped, cut apart for aluminum that could be recycled into civilian products. Others were sold to foreign air forces at bargain prices. Many more were stored in desert boneyards, wrapped in protective coverings against the elements, waiting for decisions about their fate. But the Mustang proved too valuable to simply discard. In 1948, when the newly independent U.S. Air Force restructured its designation system, the P for pursuit was changed to F for fighter. The P-51 became the F-51. Rather than phasing it out immediately in favor of jets, the Air Force retained several wings of F-51s in active service and assigned many more to Air National Guard units. The reasoning was pragmatic. Jet fighters like the F-80 Shooting Star and F-84 Thunderjet were faster, but they were also maintenance-intensive, fuel-hungry, and had limited range. For many roles, ground attack, reconnaissance, air defense, the Mustang remained highly capable, and critically there were thousands of them available, along with spare parts, trained mechanics, and experienced pilots. When the Korean War erupted in June 1950, F-51 Mustangs were among the first American fighters deployed to the theater. The USAF's F-80 jets were stationed in Japan, but Korean airfields were rough and poorly equipped. The F-51, designed for operations from grass fields in England, handled Korean conditions better. Its combat radius, while short by jet standards, was adequate for missions within the Korean peninsula, and its weapons load with 650 caliber guns plus bombs and rockets made it effective for close air support. F-51s flew thousands of ground attack missions in Korea, supporting UN ground forces, interdicting supply lines, and attacking enemy positions. The work was dangerous. Ground fire brought down many aircraft, but the Mustang proved it could still contribute a decade after its combat debut. Ironically, the F-51 outlasted early jets in Korean service. The F-80 and F-84 eventually replaced it, but not until 1953. Beyond American service, the P-51 found a second life in dozens of foreign air forces. Countries that couldn't afford to develop their own fighter aircraft or who needed capable fighters quickly turned to surplus Mustangs. By the mid-1950s, over 50 nations had operated the type. Israel's fledgling Air Force acquired P-51s in 1948 and used them extensively during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Sweden purchased 157 Mustangs and operated them until 1954. Switzerland, neutral during the war, bought 100 Mustangs afterward to modernize its air force. China, South Africa, the Philippines, multiple Latin American countries. The list of operators grew to encompass nearly every continent. Some nations flew their Mustangs well into the 1980s. The Dominican Republic didn't retire its last F-51s until 1984, nearly 40 years after the aircraft's combat debut. For smaller air forces with limited budgets, the Mustang offered proven reliability, straightforward maintenance, and adequate performance at a fraction of the cost of modern jets. The aircraft's longevity testified to the soundness of Edgar Schmued's original design. The airframe was structurally robust, capable of handling stresses that would have broken lesser aircraft. The systems were relatively simple and maintainable. The performance envelope, while no longer cutting edge, remained respectable. Most importantly, the basic design had been right from the start, aerodynamically clean, efficiently packaged, with room for upgrades and modifications. But while the Mustang achieved legendary status, its designer remained largely unknown outside aviation circles. Edgar Schmued continued working at North American Aviation after the war, contributing to designs like the F-52 Twin Mustang and the F-86 Saberjet. But his relationship with company management deteriorated. Despite his critical role in the P-51's development, he was never promoted to chief engineer or given equity in the company. In 1952, he left North American and joined Northrop Corporation as vice president of engineering. At Northrop, Schmued led development of the F-5 Freedom Fighter, a lightweight supersonic fighter designed for export. The F-5 embodied many of the same principles as the P-51: simplicity, reliability, low cost, and effectiveness. It became one of the most successful export fighters of the Cold War era, serving over 20 nations and remaining in production for decades. Schmued retired from Northrop in the late 1960s, but continued working as an independent consultant. He died in 1985 at age 85, having received various aviation industry awards, but never achieving widespread public recognition. He never held a pilot's license and didn't fly in a P-51 Mustang until 1981, 4 decades after designing it. The irony is striking. The man who created one of history's most successful fighters lived modestly, worked in relative obscurity, and received none of the public acclaim given to celebrity pilots or military leaders. Histories of World War II aviation mention him, if at all, in passing. His name is absent from most popular accounts of the air war. This reflects a broader truth about engineering and innovation. The people who design transformative technologies are often invisible to the public. Generals and politicians appear in photographs and newsreels. Pilots become aces and heroes. Engineers work in drafting rooms and factory floors, their contributions buried in technical reports and patent filings. Schmued's story also illustrates the arbitrariness of recognition. He was a self-taught immigrant who fled economic collapse, worked his way across continents, and applied himself with relentless discipline to understanding aerodynamics and structural design. He had no formal engineering degree, no prestigious university credentials, no connections to the American military-industrial establishment. What he had was talent, persistence, and the opportunity to apply both at a critical moment. The P-51 Mustang succeeded because it emerged at the intersection of necessity, technology, and institutional willingness to adopt it. The crisis of bomber losses in 1943 created desperate demand. Rolls-Royce's Merlin engine provided the transformative component. American industrial capacity enabled mass production. And eventually, after bureaucratic resistance was overcome, the aircraft reached operational units in decisive numbers. Any of those elements failing would have produced a different outcome. If the Merlin hadn't been available, the Mustang would have remained a low-altitude fighter of limited strategic value. If Packard couldn't scale up engine production, deployment would have been delayed. If USAAF leadership had continued prioritizing other fighters, the P-51 might never have reached Europe in meaningful numbers. The legacy of the Mustang extends beyond military service. In the post-war years, surplus P-51s found their way into civilian hands. Some were converted for air racing, with modified engines producing extraordinary power. At the Reno Air Races, which began in 1964, Mustangs became dominant in the unlimited class, the premier category for piston engine racers. Racing Mustangs are highly modified machines. Engines are rebuilt to produce 3,000 horsepower or more using techniques that would have been impossible in the 1940s. Modern metallurgy, advanced superchargers, exotic fuels, computer-optimized tuning. Airframes are lightened, streamlined, and reinforced. Propellers are custom designed. The result is aircraft capable of speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, far beyond what any wartime Mustang achieved. These racers bear little resemblance to combat aircraft beyond their basic shape, but they demonstrate the fundamental soundness of Schmued's design. An airframe created in 1940 remains competitive in 21st century racing because its aerodynamics were correct from the beginning. The laminar flow wing that NACA developed and Schmued incorporated remains efficient at high speeds. The structure is strong enough to handle stresses far exceeding wartime loads. The racing Mustangs also represent a peculiar form of preservation. Museums display static P-51s as historical artifacts, frozen in time, but racing keeps them alive as functioning machines pushed to performance limits, maintained by skilled technicians, flown by pilots who understand their capabilities. There's an argument that this is the most authentic form of preservation, and not as museum pieces, but as working aircraft doing what they were designed to do: fly fast. Beyond racing, warbird collectors maintain and fly restored P-51s. These aircraft appear at air shows worldwide, demonstrating combat maneuvers, formation flying, and the distinctive sound of the Merlin engine at full power. For audiences, seeing and hearing a Mustang is a visceral connection to history, not abstract dates and statistics, but a physical machine that shaped events. The number of airworthy P-51s has declined over decades as attrition, accidents, and parts scarcity take their toll. But hundreds still exist in museums and private collections. Some are meticulously restored to original configuration. Others have been modified for safety or performance. Nearly all are treasured as tangible links to an era when air combat was measured in seconds, fought at 25,000 feet, and decided by who saw the enemy first. The technical legacy is equally significant. The Mustang demonstrated that long-range fighter escort was possible, fundamentally changing strategic bombing doctrine. It proved that aerodynamic efficiency could compensate for limitations in raw power. It showed that international collaboration, American airframe, British engine, combined expertise, could produce results neither nation could have achieved alone. Post-war fighter design absorbed these lessons. The importance of range, high-altitude performance, and clean aerodynamics became standard requirements. The F-86 Sabre, designed by Schmued after the war, incorporated swept wings and jet propulsion, but retained the emphasis on efficiency and handling that characterized the Mustang. Many of the principles visible in the P-51 appear in subsequent fighters, adapted to new technologies, but recognizably descended from the same design philosophy. Over 15,000 P-51 Mustangs were produced during and immediately after World War II. Packard manufactured over 55,000 Merlin engines, most destined for Mustangs. These numbers represent industrial achievement on a staggering scale, transforming raw materials into complex machines month after month, year after year, while maintaining quality and incorporating design improvements. The human cost of producing that output is often overlooked. Factory workers, many of them women who entered the workforce during wartime labor shortages, assembled Mustangs on production lines, installed Merlins, tested systems, and delivered finished aircraft to military acceptance inspectors. Their labor, often performed under grueling conditions, was as essential as the pilots who flew the aircraft or the engineers who designed them. Today, the P-51 Mustang occupies a unique place in aviation history. It's among the most recognizable World War II aircraft, instantly identifiable by its profile, its sound, and its polished aluminum finish. It appears in films, documentaries, video games, and countless books. For many people with no specialized interest in aviation, the Mustang is the iconic American fighter of the war. That iconic status isn't unearned. The aircraft genuinely was exceptional. Not perfect, not without flaws, but exceptional in the ways that mattered most. It could go farther, fight harder, and come home more reliably than alternatives. It arrived when needed, in quantities that mattered, and performed missions that changed strategic outcomes. But the story behind that success is more complex than simple narratives of American ingenuity triumphing. It's a story of international collaboration, bureaucratic resistance, desperation driving innovation, immigrant contributions, and thousands of individuals, designers, engineers, workers, pilots, mechanics, whose combined efforts produce something greater than any could have achieved alone. Edgar Schmued died without fanfare. The Mustang he designed continues flying, racing, and inspiring. That disparity between the visibility of the machine and the obscurity of its creator is perhaps the final irony. History remembers icons. It forgets the hands that built them. The rejected fighter, powered by a foreign engine designed by a self-taught immigrant, became the instrument of air superiority over Europe and the Pacific. It served for 4 decades in dozens of nations, set speed records, and won races. And it remains, 75 years after its combat debut, a symbol of what engineering, necessity, and human determination can accomplish when circumstances align. In every war machine, there's a human story. This one belongs to Edgar Schmued, to the workers who built the Mustangs, to the pilots who flew them, and to the bomber crews whose lives were saved by silver fighters that could finally reach Berlin and come home.